Sorry about that. I think there's people in the other room not realizing this is coming here.
Oh no.
We think someone turned the screen off.
Oh, what did you do?
Well, my students over there said that someone turned on the blank screen. But it's going?
The video, not sound yet. There, I think it's on there, and they're trying to get sound.
Okay.
There's lots of room over here. Just tell people to come over here.
Okay. My students had said that it's possible that the projector is just on mute.
Do you know what they use?
I don't know.
It doesn't. It's not like.
I can hold up your.
If you-
I think this is how we control it.
Yes.
It was the PC3 the last time. The PC3 is this? Oh. Well, no, I mean, you made a keynote. I promised you a projector that would work. All right, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we could move to the other room, but everyone's in here now. Well, it is up to you, and I want to get started so that there's enough time. We're already 15 minutes late. Yeah. Yeah, we can see if we can go. Okay. All right, so we are trying to iron out some of these technical difficulties. The projector does not seem to be working, but our distinguished keynote speaker has said that she is happy to go without projection for the moment. So while our booth robots back there are trying to figure stuff out, it is my pleasure to introduce Alana Bennett, who is joining us from New York to talk to us about Harry Potter. My name is Paul Booth. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the organizer of this event. And it's really my honor to introduce you to Alana, not only because she's like this real expert on Harry Potter, but it's also her birthday. And as those of you that have come to the pop culture event know, we always give an award to our distinguished speakers. So I'm very happy to present you with our Distinguished Speaker Award. I don't think I told her she was going to be getting it today.
Thank you.
So with no further ado, I will let Alana take over because we are running a little bit late. But if this runs a little bit late, that's fine. We can kind of push things back a bit too. So.
Hello. I've never done a talk like this before, so it's nice to already see. Oh, try to do the mic.
We should have a mic that works, but you know.
Hello.
Nope.
Hello. Hello. Yes. Okay. Cool. I've never done a talk like this before, so I'm nervous. But hold on. But I also want to make this as much of a discussion as possible, so I'm only going to talk at you for like a few minutes, and then we can just talk together. I'm more interested in your Harry Potter opinions than mine. So I kind of want today to present this like theory that has been running through my head. It's not a particularly original theory or like a proven theory, but it's just something that I've been thinking a lot about with Harry Potter, and with just the way that conversation in the mainstream has changed around fandom and around representation and around what audiences are demanding from the art and media that they consume. And the theory is basically that Harry Potter's impact doesn't just end at the fact that almost every person in the world knows, about the series or about specific details of the series. It's also played a part in changing the way that multiple generations consume and interact with their art and media. I'm talking everything from blockbusters to book series to journalism and TV shows and tweets and Tumblrs. Some of you might have noticed that our modern age with Twitter and Tumblr and everything, the conversations about what audiences are demanding from Hollywood and from media and from publishing are all over the place. Just look at Ghost in the Shell and the controversy around casting Scarlett Johansson, who was a white woman, in a role that a lot of people thought should have been played by an Asian woman. When that didn't do well at the box office, the studio that produced Ghost in the Shell literally blamed the conversations around representation and the demand for it on that failure. Those conversations have always been happening, but they haven't always been reaching the mainstream in the same way, and they haven't always been getting that credit in actually impacting, the way that studios do their work. Don't get me wrong, Harry Potter was obviously not the only thing that influenced this change. There are thousands of factors, and without the very existence of mediums like social media, we would absolutely not be in this moment right now. But I do think that Harry Potter played a big part. It did, after all, have a major role in the very creation of what fandom looks like on the internet. The amount of fan fiction, fan art, and fan discussion that took place online during the first Harry Potter boom was staggering and pretty much revolutionary. People could not and still cannot stop hashing out every single aspect of Harry Potter, from what we love to what we want to make better. Just look at the programming for this conference. It's like I just sat in on the queer readings of Harry Potter panel. There's ones about like resistance, and these conversations are everywhere, and they're embedded in the way that we talk about Harry Potter and in fandom today. Harry Potter's fandom led as it set up camp like right at the beginning of the internet in a way, and it led to very engaged fan networks like what we find on Tumblr, and Tumblr's fan networks in turn, and the discussions that happen there around everything from racism, sexism, intersectionality to whether Sirius Black and Remus Lupin were in love with each other, helped influence the conversation we're now seeing in that mainstream space about representation and the changing standards that audiences are rallying for. Just think about the conversation that happened around Star Wars when The Force Awakens came out. When the conversation about Finn and Poe is always a conversation that would have happened. It's not necessarily a conversation that would have been written about in like national outlets, and it's not a conversation that would have necessarily gotten the credence that it got in shining a spotlight on how people really, really want queer representation, not just in their fanfic, but also in the mainstream outlets and the studios and the major projects and the major franchises. It's long been said that Harry Potter is the ultimate fandom gateway drug. And what we've seen over the past 10 years or so is that modern fandom and the couple of generations that have grown up with Harry Potter is engaging more and more directly with the people who create their media and telling them what they want and need from it. So I have a couple examples, specifically from what I've observed in my 2 years working at BuzzFeed. In 2014 and 2015, I started noticing a trend was picking up speed on Tumblr. People were interpreting characters from Harry Potter, most often Harry and Hermione, as people of color. And it started to take hold in a really interesting way. Eventually, I was seeing more examples of these characters as people of color on my dash than I was seeing them as white characters. Whether you consider it race bending or just reading between the lines, it's almost always filling in blanks around subtext and thematic elements, and almost always trying to build spaces for identities and demographics that aren't often given a major spotlight in Harry Potter. And eventually, the official Harry Potter production of Harry Potter and the Cursed Child obviously cast a Black actress, Noma Dumezweni, as Hermione. And they don't credit that shift to fan expression, but given the timing, it's hard to imagine that the decision happened in a void, especially since we know that J.K. Rowling was aware of the trend. She favorited multiple tweets of fan art of Hermione as a woman of color on Twitter in like February of 2015, and by December of 2015, that's when the casting happened. And she also tweeted that she was in support of Black Hermione, and that she tweeted something about how she had always meant for Hermione to be interpreted as whatever ethnicity you want, which, you know, you can believe her or not, but it was definitely, it was a big moment, even if she didn't always actually intend for Hermione to be interpreted as other than white. Now she is officially however you want to see her. This past November, I interviewed a bunch of fans and wrote about the state of Harry Potter in 2016. Melissa Anelli, who headed up the Leaky Cauldron and has written books about Harry Potter and runs the Harry Potter conference LeakyCon, said that the biggest thing that's changed in fandom is that we are more accepting of the notion that it's okay to dislike something about that fandom. A couple of years ago, when you'd voice opposition, you'd be shouted down. For an example of this, just look back to the programming for last year's LeakyCon, which on Saturday featured back-to-back panels. Cursed Child was so great and so can you at noon, followed by We Deserve Better, Why It's Okay to Reject Cursed Child as Canon at 1 p.m. As I explore in the piece that I did the interview for, Harry Potter is in a really weird place right now. We have at least 4 Fantastic Beasts movies ahead of us, and people are feeling very mixed feelings about it, especially after Cursed Child, which people have very mixed reactions to. Nobody can really picture where Harry Potter will be in 10 years or where any of us will be in 10 years. But one thing that's for sure is that we'll be having conversations about what we want and don't want from this thing that we love or loved so much. And that we'll always be having we'll also be having those conversations around other media and art, partially because Harry Potter and the active fandom around it helped so many people learn how to be active instead of passive audience members. With that in mind, I want to turn things kind of back to you guys. Does anyone have any questions or comments, disagreements, agreements, additional thoughts? Can you think of other examples of what I'm talking about in Harry Potter or in other medias and fandoms? I didn't dive into everything, so what elements do you think I'm missing? Yeah. Tell me about yourselves. Yes.
Hi, can you talk to us a little bit about how you started writing about TV and entertainment and Harry Potter specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my obsession with pop culture probably did start with Harry Potter. I think it was the first one that I actively engaged in. I didn't actually start with the first book, technically. I was in 4th grade. My teacher decided to start reading the 4th book to us aloud because it had just come out. And the first movie was about to come out, and so I decided to dive in. And it was really one of the first things that I found a community around, and it spiraled into, and I have always been a TV lover, and I realized as I was growing up that I didn't want I wanted to keep being as active as possible in my viewing and relationship with pop culture and with Harry Potter and stuff like that. So, I started writing about it. I realized I could keep writing about it. I realized and keep engaging with those fandoms, and that I could make use of that publicly. And that's pretty much the story. Yes.
So as an example, another fandom that's have gone through a similar thing. This isn't actually my primary fandom. My primary fandom is Doctor Who,
Good.
and that's been going for more than 50 years
Yes.
now. And I mean, and has had fan involvement to the point that pretty much the reboot of it that happened in 2005, that was fans
Mm-hmm.
running the show at that point.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting seeing what happens when a fandom has been around for that long.
Yeah.
That you start getting, the lunatics take over the asylum.
Yes. Yeah, Doctor Who is definitely a really interesting example, especially considering that, with Doctor Who and with shows like Sherlock, you saw a lot of the joy and the strain of audiences being able to interact directly with the creators and the people who are making their stories.
We have a PowerPoint for you now.
I mean, I can run through my slides if we want that. But if anyone has questions in the meantime or wants to talk about Doctor Who. It's gone? Oh, no. Okay. Doctor Who. Thank you. Yes. Yeah.
This is not about Doctor Who.
That's fine.
2 episodes. My apologies, Dr. Booth. I know, thumbs down. But I'm curious what the subtexts are that have led people to believe that Harry and or Hermione are an ethnicity other than Caucasian. What evidence is in the books that lends credence to that? Those Tumblrs haven't come across my feed. I'd be really curious to see them.
I think that more than I think it's like a lot of things with fandom and fan fiction. I think it's not necessarily that people reading it are straight up like, of course, Hermione is this ethnicity, her parents are from this background, or Harry is, etc. I think it's more like they see seeds of the themes that go with them, and they apply those themes in a way that is filling something that they wanted to see, but don't necessarily always see. So it's like for Hermione, a lot of it was like a lot of her themes, and like reading this, like I'm a biracial woman, reading Hermione growing up, a lot of her story hit me really hard because it was all about her she was facing, like, a lot of her story is racism allegory. So she's like in this school, she doesn't know exactly where she fits within everything. And people are reading her differently because of where she came from. They are like being actively like prejudiced towards her for it. They're calling her slurs. And a lot of her story is like, and she becomes like an activist through that. So, and Harry too, the orphan story, and all of the blood politics in Harry Potter pretty much lend themselves to like racial allegories. And I think that people were picking up on that, and they were picking up on the fact that Harry Potter doesn't have a lot of major characters of color. It's like Kingsley Shacklebolt and Dean Thomas as like the black characters in show. And they were seeing that there was this space for it. And I don't think it was necessarily like J.K. Rowling meant this. I think it was, we can do this. We have this power. We've been in this fandom for so long, making the story to make it even more meaningful for ourselves through what we create. So we're kind of freewheeling, and it doesn't necessarily matter if J.K. Rowling does, validate it, but that she did validate it, I think, is a very big deal, because it doesn't necessarily mean you can't keep freewheeling and spin it all in whatever direction. But I think it's definitely like now going forward, Hermione is not just this one thing that people assume that she would always be.
Yeah, I think there's also just that because there's nothing that she doesn't announce that all the characters are white.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's an assumption. Like if they're not described as being a person of color, then it is assumed that they are white, because that's the default, right?
Right.
So there's no reason for that.
Yeah, I definitely saw that a lot growing up. I did it myself growing up. I read Hermione as white growing up, and then I was rereading, I think it was like the second or third book, and it's just like the small kernel. It's like she comes back from vacation, and like and in a description, Harry describes her as like brown skinned. Like other parts of the book describe her as very pale skinned or like white, but it's like you find these kernels with Harry too. It's like they're not usually describing skin tone with these characters, so it's like you have space. It's like, I mean, the same with queer readings. It doesn't necessarily always like say, it never says outright, even with the gay character, that something that queerness is happening, but like a 30-line stare between Remus and Sirius, and it's like, and their like whole dynamic is like begs for that. Yes, in the back.
I think it's also of the characters of color that do exist in Harry Potter universe. J.K. Rowling specifically color, or that they're not white, and I think that lends itself as well, like, for folks of color, when we're reading these characters, that we are desperately like searching for something that I think like you kind of have to read Hermione as a woman of color, a girl of color, because she's not clearly seen.
Anyone else?
I was just gonna say that also, I know in some of the posts that I saw on Tumblr that went viral that were about reading Harry, a lot of those were in the context of reading him instead as like South Asian, and doing that because kind of jumping off of the Dursleys' reaction to James Potter and saying, okay, the reason why the Dursleys were so prejudiced against James and referred to him as like one of those people, or I forget exactly what the term was, but that kind of language that the Dursleys were using to talk about the Potters. So saying, okay, Harry's, Lily probably was white, but Harry's father probably was like South Asian, and of course in Britain, there's a lot of the racial politics are in that regard. A lot of the tensions are between South Asians and whatnot because of the whole colonial stuff. But so I think that was where a lot of the Harry's being not white came from. And then the Hermione readings, like you were saying, I think a lot of in terms of textual support, came from, like you were saying, the brown skin or the bushy hair. But ultimately, also as you were saying, I think it wasn't as important to the people who were making those readings that it was what J.K. wanted or what she was intending. The point was that it was something that they could pull from the text, and that was what they were using fandom for. How do I take what's there and turn it into what I want it to be or what I need from it? And so if what you need from it is to be able to see yourself in the stories that you're consuming, then you take fan fiction and fan art and you make it what you want.
That's one of my favorite things about like just watching Tumblr or like about modern fandom and fandom in general is just like watching the way that like once somebody says that all of that stuff about James and Harry, watching somebody say that and it's like one person or like a few people, and then it takes hold in this really interesting way, because like I really didn't expect for it to like actually become the way that fandom actually discussed these characters as like almost a whole. Like obviously it doesn't reach every like nook and cranny, but it took over in a really interesting way, and now like it's practically all I see. I very rarely see new fan art of Harry or Hermione on my dash without them being some kind of person of color, usually what we have already described. So people take it and they're like, wait, this works really well. This is the way we're thinking about it now. It's like there's multiple fandoms where we don't know the name of a character, but within discussion amongst the community, you kind of decide on one, and then that name becomes, the like one that people like hold on to. I think there's a better example than this, but one of the ones I can think of right now is in The Handmaid's Tale, the main character never gets a name. But the fandom kind of picked up on this thing that her name was June, because in the beginning of the book, Margaret Atwood is describing is naming all of these women, and the only one that doesn't recur is the name June. So people were like, that might be the main character's name. Margaret Atwood has said that wasn't her intention, but she's like, sure, you can have that. That's fine. But yeah, I just love that fandom like globs onto that stuff. Anyone else? Yes.
I wonder if you could, especially for maybe the students who are here, talk about how writing for BuzzFeed, writing pop culture stuff for BuzzFeed, kind of is as a career, and how do the people at BuzzFeed feel about the work that you do, and how do you fit into the media sphere?
That's a big question.
Sorry, big question.
Yeah, I like BuzzFeed. I got hired as a geeky writer in 2015 because of a piece I wrote about respending Hermione. And I wrote, there are different, BuzzFeed is kind of segmented, and it's like on one side is news and features and stuff, and on one side is like lists and like 50 times Grey's Anatomy made you want to die. So I spent like a year and a half-ish writing a lot. I mean, I wrote a lot about Harry Potter during that time, but it was a lot of like it was like diving through Tumblr and curating like those lists and stuff like that. And right now I am on news now, writing a lot of features, and that's when I wrote about how the Harry Potter is changing at this weird crossroads. I was about to say forklift. That's not what that is. What was the rest of the question? Just like how?
Yeah, I mean, we live in an information age,
Mhm.
and we get so much of our news and entertainment from places like BuzzFeed.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a dialogue at BuzzFeed about that? Like, do they?
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting to me that you described. I'm writing for the news,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a piece about Harry Potter fandom, which I think is really exciting as a person that makes a living studying fandom. But I don't know if everyone would consider that news.
Yeah.
So like, how does that play out?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's Harry Potter is something that you can write as much as you want to about, like on BuzzFeed about it, because people will click on it, and because it will get like 1 million views, or it will get like over like 100,000 views. And so like there's really I really exploited that well for a while, because it's something that I'm always thinking about. And so when I didn't have something else in my brain at work, I was like, well, I'm always thinking about Harry Potter. Might as well go through my Tumblr tag. But it's really something that, and especially because it's still going, like I don't know what the state of things would be if, Pottermore hadn't popped up immediately after the last movie, or if Fantastic Beasts hadn't been announced. Like there's always something. Like even when I left on Thursday at the office, it was announced that Cursed Child is coming to Broadway in this next April. And so there's always something new to it. And also I'm on the entertainment team. We deal a lot with just like what's happening in like the culture, and Harry Potter is of the culture. So it's like that kind of stuff is always around. It's like, but it's interesting when like being on the geeky team at the beginning, it was interesting to see which fandoms they wanted us to write about and which ones they were like, oh, there's not the audience for this, because it's a very big fandom on Tumblr, say, but it's not necessarily something that, like a mainstream mass audience would read about. But that doesn't mean that it's not valuable or valid. It's just like finding which ones they'll like let you do at a certain time, because it's like, and more it's the stuff that is fandom-ish is also mainstream. But there's always going to be pockets, because I mean, one of the best things about fandom is that they find the stuff that nobody else is really hitting at, or parts of the things that nobody else is hitting at. But.
So still carrying on with that with your job, how do you figure out what you want to write about? Like, is there like a process, or do people ask you, I want to see an article about this? So how do you know what you're going to write about next when you start writing for BuzzFeed or anything in general?
It's mostly about just being a part of the conversation, or like being aware of what conversations are happening in the world right now. So I'm very active on social media, partially because it's important to my job to keep up with what people are saying and what people are talking about. I don't know what I'm going to write about next at this moment, yeah, it's very much just about like what interests you, what do you have this curiosity about, or what do you think hasn't been said about like a specific thing that's happening in the world now. Like I hadn't seen, part of why I wrote my feature about Harry Potter recently was that I hadn't seen somebody really articulate what I had been noticing happening in fandom the past few years with Harry Potter, which was this kind of like this exhaustion that kind of was in conflict with our like long-standing love of the series, and the fact that we don't want to let it go, but like, you know, sometimes it's like sometimes it's like when Cursed Child was coming out, it was like, I'm gonna read this. I went to a midnight release of it. I was like, this is gonna take me back to like days. But like reading it, I was very conflicted because I was like, this gave me a Black Hermione, which is something I wanted for so long. But also there are so many things in the plot that I personally disagree with still, and could go on. I went on a very long rant about it last night even. So it's just, and so I wanted to kind of portray that. And so I interviewed a lot of fans about it, and kind of, and just tried to find the face of it, and tried to find like the different examples of like the people who are staying with it, and the people who are still very genuinely excited about it and are like kind of peeved that other people are like shitting on their parade, and then the people who are like, okay, but did they have to do queer baiting for these characters, or did or just like all of the, or do they have, why is Grindelwald like have a weird eye and like blonde hair and like why is he Johnny Depp? And all of these conversations that are happening and will continue to happen. So it's kind of just finding what people are talking about and thinking about and feeling. A lot of BuzzFeed is just like hitting at what people like identity, and hitting at what people are going to like making people feel a certain emotion for like 20 things on a list or something. So I did a lot of like, these moments from Harry Potter will make your day, or they'll ruin your day. And just kind of playing around with all of that. I don't know. Yes.
So sticking with your career, what would I tell my students about how they could get a job like yours?
I remember going through this as a student, asking every single person who had a job that I wanted how to do it, and they all said pretty much the same thing, which is that like there's no uniform path, especially now. Like I think there used to be like a certain like, you get an editorial assistant job and then you work your way up and you make coffee and then you write things. But for me now, and especially like just with the internet and the way that everything works, I think it's just you kind of just write. like if you want to be a writer right now, then, you know, if you want to write for the internet and you want to write like certain types of things for the internet, then like read a bunch of the examples, figure out like what the form is, how it kind of works, and then just kind of, you know, find your school paper. Or like I made a TV blog where I just kind of, it was the age of recaps, and I like did it with a friend, and we just chose shows to recap all the time, and that got us used to the form. And like I was going through like my time hop or something, and it was like a Facebook post from 2009, and my friend had written on my wall like 100 people were at my office recap yesterday, which is not a large number for like what I do now, but it was so exciting to us then. And like find stuff like that, and like even if nobody's reading it, you have examples of your work, and then you know, work your way into, you know, getting somebody to give you the opportunity to do more of it. And just kind of just keep doing it. Like the biggest thing with writing is you just have to write, and network and talk to whoever you can. So, yes, you.
Okay. Going along those same lines, thank you so much for giving us a much more up-to-date view of the writer's job and what, you know, that task that was sometimes glamorized in the field. I teach college writing, 101, 102. You clearly have an interest, both in reading and writing. I'm curious to know what your writing background as an undergraduate college student was like, and if it prepared you to do what you do now, or if this has been a passion that you have fostered with, or perhaps in spite of whatever you were in this desk learning.
Yeah. Well, for one, I went to Oberlin College. We didn't have a journalism program.
Okay.
I didn't take specifically writing classes. I was a film major. So I knew what I was interested in. And I tried to learn as much about that as possible. And I knew that I was interested in writing. So, one of the first things I did was I reached out to the school papers and tried to figure out which one would fit me best and which ones would help me explore the things that I wanted to do and kind of experiment with with the possibilities. So I did that. I started writing opinion pieces for the school paper, and then I started that TV blog that 100 people read, and then I used that to get an internship at a very small TV website that probably 1,000 people read, and did recaps for them. I did transcribing of the interviews that they did with celebrities in very busy bars, and I had to they were saying words I didn't understand, and I just transcribed that. And I used that to get another internship at the Mary Sue, which is a geeky feminist website. And the Mary Sue kept an interest in we kept in touch. And so when they needed something a summer later, they needed an interim assistant editor. I did that for a summer, and then I freelanced for them. And I kept doing stuff for the TV website, and then I kept writing for the paper. I edited blogs and stuff. So it was pretty much just getting as many hands as possible in it. And so a lot of that wasn't my technically what I was studying, but what I was studying also informed all of that. So it's pretty much even if it is technically extracurricular, it can still be this huge part of your life and this thing that you are learning in a really meaningful way.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
I wanted to go back to kind of even before your remarks, early in what you were saying, you talked about the role that Harry Potter played in kind of inventing fan fiction as we know it now. And I'm thinking back to the days when the books were first coming out and we had those gaps in between them, and we would all sit around and talk about, who's RB and, down to micro details of the books and just hashing those through. And I'm wondering if that is that's over now, right? Because the books are all out and those questions are all answered. So that way of engaging with the books was only of that moment. But I'm wondering if that way of engaging with the books led into the fan fiction, if you would connect those, or if there's separate ways of interacting with the books.
I think they're very deeply connected, because I think that part of the fan fiction boom came from that gap, a huge part of it. As we were theorizing and weaving these things, they were 500,000 word, million word fanfics about who RIP was, and every little aspect that we didn't know yet, or we did so it must be so interesting to go back and read fanfics from between books, because that posited what would happen in the next ones and that weren't correct, because they're still just as valid as any other fan fiction, because it's not dependent on what happens next. It is making what happens next. But I think they're very, very deeply connected and all feed off of each other and roll into the huge ball of how we interact with it. Because also then when those books do come out and you wrote a specific storyline, or you wrote a story where somebody comes out or something like that, and you really, or you wrote Dumbledore is out in the pages, and then you find it's not on the page with the way that Jo wrote it, and then she just says it in an interview later, and then that's not enough, and then you're kind of interacting with that in such an interesting way. I think it all just feeds off of each other. Yes, you.
So if this is the 20th anniversary of published, I wonder, if we've had 20 years of Potter, what does the future hold? What are your hopes for the future of the Harry Potter fandom? Whether that's something that you hope days or something that you hope changes? What do you kind of hope in the future?
It's a very big question that I think about all the time. It haunts me. But I think in like vague terms, I hope that as a fandom, we kind of come to a certain peace between what is going to continue to be quote unquote canonically put out in like in this area. And then as we continue to build it into what we envision it in this area, I hope that we find a peace between that. I think it's in a lot of conflict right now, and I think that conflict is good and productive in a lot of ways. And I also hope that this side learns from this side and kind of like sees that the culture, in which ways the culture has changed, and like listens to it and listens to the criticism. I hope that J.K. Rowling hires some consultants. I hope that, especially as Fantastic Beasts, like it's promising to like be in different countries each time, or like different continents. It's like, we're gonna go to every continent. I'm like, okay, if you know how, because it's like the first books are very much like J.K. Rowling's classical education, her knowledge of, you know, British politics, and like what she knew like relatively intimately from what she put in the books. Now it's not that, you know, we saw that when she wrote about America on Pottermore, the stuff from our history that she glossed over or ignored or just didn't see as like, or she didn't interpret it in the ways that felt true to American history and like the conflicts there. So I hope that it finds a way to be more mindful of that stuff. I've made the fact that it's just going to keep going forever and I have no say in it. 50, they'll be like, hey, you want to direct a Marauders miniseries? But yeah, I think it's like mostly like vague stuff. Like, I hope that each side learns from each other, mainly this side from this side, and that it's like productive going forward and evolves going forward and doesn't just get stuck. Because I think that's my biggest thing with like sure, reboot things, don't let anything die ever. But I think that with any reboot, from like Gilmore Girls to Spider-Man to like whatever, we have to acknowledge that the reasons that it worked in 2003 are not the same reasons that it's going to work in 2017 or 2020. And we need to update those standards and conversations and themes. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
Do you think that, I mean, kind of going back to what you were talking about, like sort of controversial casting and how like you can recognize that studios have to balance like this movie has to make money, which means it needs a bankable star, versus being true to whatever source material it came from, which might piss off these people on the internet a lot, which creates this feedback that goes to the studio. Do you think as studios are not so focused on a specific market anymore the way they used to be, that will get better, that there won't be that one movie that comes out every year that surprises Hollywood because they're like, oh, there is a market for this, and then they make a bunch of clones of it that are bad, and then claim that person was a fluke, and then just go back to what they know because you know.
Yeah.
But as the U.S. market isn't the only market anymore, do you think that'll get better?
I think in some ways it'll get better. I think especially, you know, I think that Ghost in the Shell was kind of a sign of studios being like, oh, we actually have to listen to them sometimes, which happens periodically. It's always happened periodically where they're like, oh yeah, we're gonna listen to this, and then like 2 years later they're like, what did they say again? But so I think it will get better in some ways, and then it will get worse or weirder in other ways as they try to please like international markets that become more important than the US markets in the way that you sell a film. So they're gonna start like playing towards specific prejudices or like histories that aren't ours, that are going to read differently to US audiences. So I think it's just going to be an interesting, complicated, strange conversation. Like the movie The Great Wall with Matt Damon, and like it was put what it is for good reason amongst the like Ghost in the Shell conversations about like a white character in the center of like a whole bunch of like Asian characters and like a story, but also it's complicated by the fact that like, you know, the audiences in China did not take it the way that US audiences did. They were not offended as much in the same ways. It was a completely different situation for them. They weren't like, this is whitewashed. They were like, sure, that's Matt Damon, and like whatever. So it's always complicated because it's not always like our lens is not the only lens or the only valid lens, but that doesn't mean that we can stop fighting for like the ones that like are our lens. But it's just, there are so many there's so many different like conversations to be had about it. I think it's just going to get more confusing, as is everything.
So one common theme that I've noticed that people have mentioned is that generation-wise, Harry Potter is being experienced differently, and currently there's a new generation that is experiencing Harry Potter in a completely different way that I didn't experience. So as a writer, I guess there's something that you'd like to add on, or that you've noticed while you've talked to other people, like people younger than you, even people older than you, who have shared different experiences.
I don't actually like one thing that I really do want to do is figure out more of how like people who are like, you know, maybe in like high school now or middle school, how they are experiencing Harry Potter, like the people who weren't even like necessarily like alive when the first, like who weren't alive when the first book came out, or who like grew up always knowing the like ending. You know, it's gonna be like Star Wars was for a lot of us, where like you grow up with it and it's still like incredibly valuable and important, and you're like still like, oh, this is intensely important to the culture. My parents are freaking out about it. But yeah, I'm very curious how like I've been trying to get my nephews who are 8 to read it, and I like gave them the illustrated books, but I don't know exactly how they like absorb it yet, or how they will absorb it when they are like our ages and have like sat with it for a while. Like I'm very curious what that's going to mean for Harry Potter at like the 30-year anniversary, especially as more stuff, as like it is of the past but also the present, and is by then it will probably be on the last Fantastic Beasts movie. Anyone else?
Awesome. Well, we are almost out of time anyway, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
And there are still two more panel times left to go today, so enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.